I'm sorry we can't be doing this in person. I also noted that I'm actually happen to be up in Syracuse today rather than Washington D.C. Just a short notice trip. So I'm sorry, I can't be coming down the road to do this in person, but perhaps at some point in the future. I'll make a couple of comments about the course of the war and then get back into where the things that happened over the last 6 weeks, and then leave plenty of time to jump into what you all would like to discuss. Now, for those of you who've noticed, obviously what's behind me is not Syracuse, New York. It's the great British fort of Bala Hissar, and a reminder that the Western involvement in Afghanistan dates back hundreds of years. Foreign involvement in Afghanistan, like most places in the world, we can go back and look at conflict in Afghanistan for thousands of years as well. But I think the point here is that we often like to use history as a backdrop as to explain the present. And I do think that there are some things historically in terms of Afghanistan. It is a very difficult place to control, whether you are the government of Afghanistan or whether you're a foreign invader. But at the same time, not everything is analogous. That what the British faced in the 19th century, what the Soviets faced in the late 20th century, and the reception of the Afghan people to both may not have been exactly what the reception of the Afghan people to the United States was after October 2001. And I'll get to that in just a minute. So let me take us back 20 years. September 11, 2001, the Al-Qaeda attacks on New York and Washington, D.C., the Bush administration ultimatum to the Taliban that if they didn't give up Al-Qaeda, that they would face the same consequences. The Taliban refusal to comply, the beginning of the air and ground invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001, and then, of course, 20 years of conflict there. So why did it end up the way it did? Why are our troops leaving today? Why did it take 20 years for us to come to that conclusion? Well, I think historians are going to look back at the war in Afghanistan in 4 phases. There's this initial 2001 conflict that toppled the Taliban in 6 weeks, leads to the meetings in Bonn, Germany, and then to the installation of the Karzai government. You also then have a forgotten war from 2002 to 2008, largely forgotten because of the United States refocus on Iraq. And then what you have is the rise of a Taliban insurgency. You then have the deliberate counterinsurgency campaigns roughly from 2009 to 2014, then the end of the U.S. combat operations in Afghanistan. And of course, you might be wondering, wait, if we ended combat operations in 2014, why were people talking about endless war? And why were our troops still there for another 7 years? Well, I'll get to that. That's the last phase, really the Afghan-led campaign, the U.S. and NATO-led train, advise, and assist operation that lasted from 2014 to 2021. Now, each of those has a different dynamic, but I think it's important to understand the first 3 in order to understand the last several years and the last several weeks. Again, the withdrawal of the U.S. forces and the collapse of the Afghan government. So when we first went into Afghanistan in October 2001, the United States tried to do so with a light footprint. In other words, the minimum number of forces required to get the job done. There was a belief, a well-founded one, led by the late Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and the Bush administration, that the Afghans were xenophobic and we had to make sure that we didn't look like occupiers. And what we could simply do is defeat Al-Qaeda, put in a new government, and that's it. Everything would be all over. Well, in not just in hindsight, but other people argued at the time that that was a complete misreading of the situation, that many Afghans would be delighted to have international forces in there, as the Taliban were not well liked. The Taliban are still not well liked. 90% plus of Afghans don't support the Taliban. We can get to why then the Taliban have been able to take control in a bit. It's a little more complicated. But the point being, the United States and its NATO allies overthrew the Taliban in roughly 6 weeks. There were then peace talks held at Bonn, Germany, and the first of the major failures takes place. That is, the Taliban themselves did not have a seat at the table. The Taliban were ready to surrender. All they wanted was a role in the political process. And I'm not saying it was that easy. Why didn't people not see that at the time? It was an issue at the time. The belief was, though, that the defeat had been so overwhelming that the West could impose a settlement, And the Karzai regime, or the budding Karzai regime, agreed as well. There was no reason to speak to the Taliban. The Afghans were in control. The U.S. patrons, the NATO patrons were in control, the European allies. Let's just put things together the way they want. Well, let's fast forward a couple of years. From the beginning, the southern Pashtuns, the Taliban, where the Taliban get their support, felt that the government in Kabul was not their government, that they were disenfranchised, that no one represented them. Remember, the West tried to remake the government in Kabul the way they might remake the US government, a strong centralized federal authority and weak states or weak provinces. There's a great debate over whether Afghanistan was ever centralized at one point, whether they ever had a central government, and that's fair. But the point being that whether they did or not, the people did not want a strong central government at the time. They wanted the provinces and the districts to have strength. Think of really most European nations in the late 19th century, or even if you look at places such as France and Germany during most of the 20th century, where the provinces, the states, if you will, have great authority. Even in our own nation, we've gone back and forth really for at least the last 150 years. The federal government has had preeminent authority, but states have a great deal of rights, especially if you think about things beyond foreign policy, trade, and national security. In any event, the bottom line is that the southern Pashtuns felt disenfranchised, that their federal government, their central government didn't represent them. And this helped provide the roots of the insurgency. Now, granted, there were also some traditional issues. The Taliban wanted a government in Afghanistan that was set up under their version of Sharia law, which I should say is a very extreme version of Islamic law that doesn't even comport with the Quran or thousands of years of Islamic jurisprudence. Think of it the same way we might see an extremist Christian theocracy, or extremist, if you look at the extreme parties in Israel, or extreme parties that are theocratic in any sense. They're perversions of the ideology, whether it's religious or secular, that drives it. Now, the insurgency grows from 2002 to 2006. And roughly in 2006, the NATO nations, at the time, 28 NATO nations, and its International Security Force Assistance Force, ISAF partners. So it wasn't just Europeans, but the Australians, New Zealand, the UAE, Jordan. I'm trying to think of, eventually we even had partners such as El Salvador. But again, it was a fairly global and robust group of nations that was supporting this effort. By 2006, people started to realize it was a big problem. The British in particular realized that there was a true insurgency going on. The second-term Bush administration really didn't want to deal with this. They had their hands full in Iraq. Things hadn't been going well. But it was clear that and in fact, one senior Bush administration official told me this in 2006, it was clear that we took our eye off the ball, that we really have missed what's going on in Afghanistan. Well, at the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration, there were several reviews, one done by General Petraeus, one who would later lead forces in Afghanistan, the other led by political appointees at the Bush administration, the next run by the Obama administration, and they all came to the same conclusion. More troops were needed, a more focused counterinsurgency effort. So not just an effort where we were looking at killing bad guys, but an effort to rebuild in Afghanistan was important. And of course, this sows the roots of one of the greatest debates, whether or not we should do, quote, nation building in Afghanistan. And I'll get back to that later. In any event, this gets to the next phase of the war, the counterinsurgency campaign, roughly 2009 to 2014. And before I move on to the final phase of the war, I want to kind of just address this a little bit. When most people think of counterinsurgency, they think of the Vietnam War, and that's correct. There have been many times where the West has faced insurgents or guerrillas, political movements that become armed and have to do two things. They don't just fight, but what they really try and do is supplant the government at first. And of course, as Americans, we look back at the Vietnam War and think, well, that was messed up. It was a failure. We shouldn't be there in the first place. And I'm not saying any of that is wrong. But again, there are some aspects of counterinsurgency that actually have worked pretty well in the past, not just for the Americans, but for the British. And what the effort was designed to do was deal with the need to not just defeat the Taliban, more importantly, have the Afghan military defeat the Taliban, but really to build up the Afghan government. So, for example, you hear a lot of debate about, well, we finished the counterterrorism mission, we defeated al-Qaeda, we should have gone away. That's great. You can defeat a terrorist group and then move away. But as soon as you move away, guess what? The same dynamic will happen again. It has a place to grow. The same thing with an insurgency. Dwight Eisenhower famously said, you can't kill communism with a bullet. It's the same way with any ideology. You can defeat the fighters, but you have to address the drivers of the insurgency. And that brings us back to that feeling of disenfranchisement. You have to have a political settlement. In other words, you have to have a political agreement at the table. Let's look back at something familiar, maybe from the late 90s. Bosnia, for example. Lots of fighting in the Yugoslav Civil War, 90-91, then on to 96 until the Dayton Accords, and US forces and NATO forces going in doing a peacekeeping mission. Did the Serbs and Croatians and Bosnians love each other? Absolutely not. But they stopped fighting and got to the table. Let's look at a terrorist group, the Irish Republican Army, fighting an insurgency, terrorism campaign since the 1920s with the British, until about 1996 as well, the Omagh bombing that really kind of changed the dynamics. And finally, the British and the IRA willing to sit at the table and negotiate a political settlement that, while not perfect, means that the vast majority, almost all the fighting was over. Finally, excuse me, to jump back to Afghanistan, the same piece. You can kill bad guys. That's not going to end the problem. I think that's one of the fallacies we've had, not just with the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and even the Biden administration, that once you defeat the terrorist, that's the end. Well, the only way to not go back or to not have to continue having airstrikes or drone strikes on terrorists is to make sure that the Afghans themselves can take ownership of Afghan security. And as we saw more recently, that failure to do so led to the collapse, was part of what led to the very quick collapse of the Afghan government in the face of the Taliban. So the General McChrystal, who was appointed by the President and Secretary Gates to take over the mission in Afghanistan in 2009, had what he called a counterinsurgency campaign. It wasn't just about fighting the Taliban. It was about increasing the capability of the Afghan National Security Forces to do things themselves, and then to prioritize responsive and accountable governance at all levels. Now, you might be asking yourself, why should the US military be helping the Afghans to develop responsive and accountable governance? They shouldn't. That's absolutely not the job of the US military. It's one of the fallacies of the debate over nation building. Nation building is absolutely not the job of the Department of Defense. We have two very well-established organizations that do this and do it well: the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development. In fact, USAID has an entire office that deals with conflict zones, whether it's Colombia, Burma, the Congo, Yemen, Syria, Ukraine. They do this. I'm not saying they always succeed, but what I will tell you is it's not something that takes 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, 6 years. And this is part of the problem. In the United States, we often think about policy in 2, 4, and 6 year cycles. Why? Those are election cycles. And what we watched was 3 administrations kick the ball down the road, and a 4th administration that decided to end it. Actually, it's the 3rd and 4th administration decide to end it. So in any event, we had a combined effort, USAID, the United Nations, international development communities, NGOs, and then of course the State Department. And what do the US and NATO military forces do? Their job is to provide security. Now, the realities of how our congressional budget worked set up some of the big challenges. It wasn't just the Taliban or the Afghans. And some of those big challenges included the fact that while USAID and state really were the experts at this, the Department of Defense got most of the money. That's a big problem that we had existed long before Afghanistan and still exists today. I think the number of diplomats we have at the State Department is less than the number of military band members, if I have that. Maybe I'm slightly wrong on that, but it illustrates the point. We have a ridiculously small number of diplomats. The U.S. Agency for International Development, which really is the lead organization with the expertise to counter violent extremism before we have to do things like drop bombs and send troops, is woefully under-resourced. And there's sort of an American culture, for better or for worse, that says, well, if we have an international problem and it's violent, we should use the military. Now, we have a whole class at the Maxwell School that gets into why we have these knee-jerk reactions and tries to explain to our graduate students, maybe there are other strategies and approaches that might work a little bit better. In any event, one of the great lessons identified from the failures in Vietnam in terms of counterinsurgency was that we did not do that we did sort of the same thing. The military tried to see the problem as a military task. The State Department saw things as wholly diplomatic tasks. USAID, which at the time focused on agricultural issues, saw the problems in Afghanistan and Vietnam as an agricultural problem. And none of these organizations was willing to work together in a unified way or to see the problems with a different mindset. Fast forward, 50 years later or 40 years later, and you have some of the same problems in Vietnam. In Afghanistan. And actually, it's a Freudian slip because there are a lot of things that are similar. I'm not saying in terms of the politics of the war, but the way we failed and the things we failed upon were some of the things that we should have known better about. For example, there was never a single unified commander for American efforts. You had a general on one side and an ambassador on another side. Even for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, you had a general on one side, the American general, Generals McNeil, McKiernan, McChrystal, Allen, Dunford, Nicholson, Miller, just to do the last run through. They were the NATO commanders as well, but who was coordinating the allied efforts of almost 50 coalition partners who could do development and stabilization and governance and civil society work, all those things that would create a more resilient Afghan society? We didn't have one. We certainly didn't have one single NATO ambassador. We tried, but guess what? Saudi Arabia was important. They're not part of NATO. India was important. They're not part of NATO. What about Pakistan? Well, they were a thorn in the side of everything. They weren't trying to be helpful. But again, you have no coordinated effort. And this was one of the great lessons of Afghanistan. There's a wonderful documentary out there called The Diplomat about Richard Holbrooke, the late Richard Holbrooke, who really a very larger than life figure, not always well liked, kind of a bull in a china shop. When he was a 20-something diplomat in Vietnam, he wrote a very interesting 3-page paper talking about what could we do better in Vietnam. And one of the big issues on the civilian side was unity of effort with the military. Funny enough, he pulled out that paper again in Afghanistan when he became the special representative in 2009, and same problems. There was no unified effort. He tried really hard on the US side to unify things, but again, internal bureaucratic politics. The military didn't want to be under civilian ambassadorial lead, and the State Department and USA didn't want to be under military lead. So again, institutionally, we were never resilient enough. We were never willing to do things differently. And I think that sets up some of the failures of the counterinsurgency campaign. Now, President Obama had made clear that the surge in troops, I think at one point we were at about 130,000 US and NATO forces in Afghanistan, would only be for 1 year, 2010, 11, and then we would start downsizing. That downsizing continues to 2014, at which point President Obama declares the end of combat operations in Afghanistan. The next 7 years or so was a largely focused training, advising, and assist mission. Now, that doesn't mean US forces and NATO forces weren't out there battling the Taliban. They were, but the emphasis was supposed to be on training. Why? Until you have a trained Afghan army, you aren't going to be able to leave, or you won't be able to reduce your presence to a small training mission, which, by the way, we have training missions all over the world today, whether it's a dozen forces, a couple of hundred, or many of you may not know that we still have 2,500 US forces in Iraq. Remember, 2,500 was the number we were arguing about for Afghanistan. So I joke with people, everyone says, well, we're out of the Middle East now. No, we're not. We're actually out of South Central Asia now. The Middle East, we still have 2,500 troops, different war over there. But the point being, you can sustain forces in small numbers over a longer period of time, and that was the goal. There was never any talk of a date certain for withdrawal when we drew down during the Obama administration. Now, let's fast forward to the next major issue, and I don't mean to skip over too much, but you really get the next major change is the decision by the Trump administration to get into direct negotiations with the Taliban. And then if you want to be pejorative about it, which I will be, you basically had, well, the nice way of saying it is you had a negotiated end date for the war between the Trump administration and the Taliban. The more critical way to say it is that was the end of the war. That was the surrender of the U.S. Effort. And that's my personal view, but that's an opinion that many may disagree with. In any event, what does the Trump administration agreement say? It sets a date for May 1st, 2021 for the withdrawal of U.S. forces. It also starts a major reduction in U.S. forces down from around 10,000 to where we get down to about 2,500 when the Biden administration starts. And what it does, it cuts out the Afghan government. Essentially, by the Trump administration saying, hey, no matter what, we're out of here in May 2021, all the Taliban have to do is wait. And funny enough, we weren't quite sure what they were doing in that intervening period. We now know they were simply stalling for time at the negotiating table and setting up, getting ready to set up operations that would move forward once American forces left, which we watched that play out. The Biden administration had a decision to make. Do they basically accept the Trump administration agreement with the Taliban, or do they continue the mission forward? And those of you who've been watching the president know that he's, whether you like it or not, he's taken full ownership and said, nope, we are going to, this is it. This was the agreement. We are leaving. So President Biden in the spring firmed up the dates and said that American forces would be out of there by the September 11th, later moved up to August 31st. And again, the final downsizing of U.S. troops began. And then, of course, in early August, you started to see a major Taliban advance on the capital. And then the swift collapse of the Afghan military. I think the final nail in the coffin was really President Ghani's decision to abandon Kabul. There's now a debate going on whether or not if he had stayed, things would have been a bit more stable, and whether the Taliban would have allowed Kabul to be an open international city for a month while people were evacuated. But in any event, the Afghan military didn't hold together. The Afghan political state didn't hold together. And as we watched on TV in real time, the Afghan government collapsed. So, I can, again, I'm glossing over a lot of this, but we can dive back into it. Let me get to two things here. First, I want to address broadly the question of what happened, why we lost, and then the question of what's next. Historians are going to argue for the next 50, 100, or 200 years, why did the Americans lose in Afghanistan? And first thing I have to say is there's a broader issue. It's not just the United States. I mean, there are clear reasons the United States engagement 2001 to 2020 ends in a defeat for the United States, or why we lost. But also we have to remember that you could also ask the same question, why did the Afghans lose? And that's going to be important to understand as well. I think you also have to ask a third question. Why did the Taliban win? As I tell my students, it's sort of like looking at Pearl Harbor and not studying Admiral Yamamoto's plan and only studying the shortcomings of the U.S. Army and Navy. You really have to understand both to understand what went wrong. There's some other big questions that are out there too. Was it always unwinnable? Was Afghanistan always the graveyard of empires? Did something go wrong with the training mission? Would it have been possible if we simply added more troops, more resources, or more time? Did we do fine on the military side, but did we fail on the political side? One of the more nuanced arguments about Vietnam is actually that the Viet Cong were actually largely defeated by 1968. But guess what? It didn't matter because the South Vietnamese still didn't believe in their own government. So there was no way that government could last. So You can, like historians like to do, you can pull out little pieces and say, oh, wait, this piece was successful, this piece was not successful. Absolutely. There are certain things that went very well in Afghanistan. For example, you can take a look at, people say, well, we shouldn't build a nation, we shouldn't be involved with nation building. That society changed over 20 years. You went from a society where women and girls were not permitted to be educated or learn how to read and write to a society where women were business owners, members of parliament. In fact, I think at one point, the percentage of women in the Afghan parliament was higher than the percentage of women in the US House of Representatives. You have women who are business owners, women who are community leaders, millions of girls in school, and a society that started to accept a little bit more egalitarian concepts. That's not because the US military trained them to do it. It's because the security situation was set up where the Afghan people yearning for freedom and yearning for their style of, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be Switzerland. It doesn't have to be a US style democracy. It was their own version. This is also one of the fallacies when you hear people say, well, we couldn't make Afghanistan into an American style democracy. Of course not. No one ever said you could. What you're giving is the people an opportunity to do things themselves. I've been staring at my iPad here. I remember the first time I was at a meeting with young Afghan parliamentarians, and everyone's around the table, including myself, using pen and paper for notes. And there's the 22-year-old Afghan woman who pulls out her iPad and starts writing on it. I'm like, hey, that's the future. That is the future. And now you have a generation of Afghans who has never known the rule of the Taliban. And I hope they don't sit still. We are seeing some protests, but obviously the Taliban have the ability to crush those. You also saw the growth of an independent media that was critical of its own government, which is so incredibly important to a democracy. So I don't agree with those who say nothing changed there. I think things changed significantly. The question is, what didn't work? And as I've suggested, there were certainly failures for each of the administrations. For the Bush administration, it was the failure to bring the Taliban in when we were at a position of strength, and the Afghan, and there was an opportunity for a political settlement. The Obama administration really was focused too much on a short-term fix and then getting out. In other words, all right, let's train up 300,000 Afghan soldiers and then we're done. Not thinking about the broader issues. You can't just train up a military. You have to make sure that there is that civilian governance concept, the civil society and all that. And while we put in a lot of US and NATO military forces, we never surged on the civilian side. We never did what needed to be done there. Now, I'm not saying all that would have worked. There's some people that argue that the war was lost as soon as we failed to have the Taliban at Bonn. There's a good case to be made that the Taliban were just more motivated to stay along, to stay longer, that they knew the West would eventually leave. And there is something to be said there. I remember one of the dynamics from the 2006 to 2009 or 2009 to 2011 period was that the Afghan people would say that, look, our first preference is for the West to help us, and then there will be peace. Our second preference is the Taliban win, and then there will be peace. Our third preference is continued war, because continued war is killing us. Even if you looked at 2009, there had already been about 30 years of conflict. The Soviets in the 1979 onward to 89, then about 6 years of really warlordism and anarchy, then civil war all the way through 2001. And I think the Afghans were largely sick of that. So, you can understand that they were willing to have peace either way. So where do we go from here? And then I'll open it up to questions. Well, there are a lot of considerations. One, do we negotiate with the Taliban? We've promised to get not just our own citizens out, but Afghans who helped us. And I will tell you that the Biden administration has done a lousy job getting out those Afghans who worked with us. So they got out 120,000 people, but those of you who've seen me say this publicly, a lot of those were the wrong people. We still have a lot of work to do. Now, what I will say is the Biden administration is doing much better than they were a month ago. There's a much more serious focus on it. There's a lot more, things are where they should have been before. It's not exactly where it needs to be, but it's much better. I do think the president's committed to it. I just think it's a really difficult commitment to fulfill, and I hope he and the administration have the staying power. One of the key questions is, should we recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan? That is a tough question. From a detached standpoint, I don't want to recognize the Taliban. I don't think that they took power legitimately. On the other hand, if all the Afghans who helped us could get out because we made a commitment to recognize the Taliban government, I'm not sure. Now, would that be the same as negotiating with terrorists? Some would say yes. But I'm not objective on it because I have friends who are stuck, who I've worked with closely, people who I owe my life to, who are stuck there. And if it means we have to recognize an illegitimate government, well, there are a lot of pretty horrible governments out there that we've recognized. It doesn't even mean we have to have diplomatic relations with them. Iran, Cuba, North Korea, it's there. We'll deal with it. I'd rather deal with the paper issue and the legal issue than the issue that causes the deaths of people. But again, it's an imperfect situation there. What do we do long term? We have interest in the region. Are we simply going to launch drone strikes on those who threaten to do us harm? The absolutely tragic and horrific irony is that the last air mission of the war was a drone strike that killed an innocent man, relatives, and 7 children of the 10 killed. I don't even like thinking of it. It's just one of the most horrific ways I can see to end the war, and speaks to everything that was wrong about the way we conducted it. And if that's going to be the strategy moving forward to deal with threats, I have some major concerns. And then finally, there are the regional issues. What do we do now that China is going to want a hand in Afghanistan? Good luck to them. But India also has great interests. Iran is Afghanistan's neighbor, and of course is going to have great interests. In fact, ancient history now, but in the years preceding 9/11, the Taliban were fighting with the Iranians along that border because the Taliban's main way of making money was drug smuggling. And how were they getting the drugs out? The easiest border, the Iranian border, and the Iranians didn't want to deal with that. But anyone who thinks Iran isn't going to have a role doesn't understand geography. Just like Canada is important to us, or Mexico is important to us, Afghanistan is important to Iran, and vice versa. And of course, you have the Pakistan situation. Pakistan essentially has supported the Taliban since prior to 2001. It has to do with their relationship with the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. It also has to do with their relationship with India, and that's going to be an incredible dynamic. I don't see the Russians as too much of a problem, but you do have all the stands up on the north, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, so on and so forth, that all have great interests, including the fact that many Afghans are Tajik or are Uzbek ethnically. So a lot of the dynamics don't change. The quote war isn't over necessarily. There's an armistice, a ceasefire. You still have Afghans who will resist, although it's most of the resistance has been crushed. However, that doesn't mean it's over, even if it's over just for the United States. All right, now I could have done an entire semester on Afghanistan, but I hope this gives you just a bit of an overview, some context, and I'd be happy for the time remaining to dive into some different areas and give you some of my thoughts, whether they're on the policy issue, the historical issue, or even my own experiences and interpretations of what happened. But thank you very much.